Welcome. Welcome to Public Theology. I am Shanta Bahan. Some of you have met me, and some of you are maybe meeting me for the first time this evening. I'm a member of the clergy team here. I just started in August, and I'm so delighted to meet so many of you that I don't get a chance to see on Sunday. So as you know, each week we host a guest musician, and tonight we've invited Ryan Flanagan to be our musical guest. Ryan's right here. Ryan is a songwriter and church music director at All Saints Dallas. He is also the curator of the musical collective Liturgical Folk, for which he writes new songs for the growing liturgical renewal movement in America. As an artist rooted in the Christian story, Ryan works to create beautiful and believable sacred music for the sake of the world. He believes the church can be a credible artistic witness of God's beauty, truth, and goodness to the whole world, not only for Christians. Ryan's melodies are accessible and rooted in the inherently joyful sounds of the American folk tradition. Tonight, actually, might be your very last opportunity to hear Ryan's music, because he begins theological studies at Wycliffe Hall at Oxford in the fall. So lucky you. On a more personal note, Ryan loves reading 20th century British fiction, drinking local craft coffee and beer, not together necessarily. And in addition to all of this, Ryan and his wife have 3 lovely children. Let's warmly, once again, welcome Ryan Flanagan.
Thank you.
Happy are they who have not walked in the counsel of the wicked, nor lingered in the way of sinners, nor sat in the seats of the scornful. Their delight is in the law of the Lord, and they meditate on his law day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, bearing fruit in due season, with leaves that do not wither. Everything they do shall prosper. It is not so with the wicked. They are like chaff which the wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked shall not stand upright when judgment comes, nor the sinner in the counsel of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is doomed. Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. We appreciate that. I'm Bob Johnston, and our MC tonight, Shanta, has asked me to come out and introduce our speaker and tell you a little bit about how the night's going to work if you're new with us. So if you're new to pub theology, the way the night is going to go, first of all, what we're doing with this is we are trying to have a very neutral kind of place that's, normally when it's not aftermath of COVID, we're normally in a true pub, but we're in our pub setting tonight. And the idea is to have a place where people can come and hear an interesting theological discussion on a very neutral place where it's really easy to invite folks to come and just engage. And that's what we're trying to do. A little bit about who we are before I go over the format. If you're tuning in online and you don't know who we are, what we're doing, St. Michael and All Angels is an Episcopal church near Preston Center. We're a big church that has traditional services. We have contemporary services. We have lots of dynamic formation opportunities, and I would encourage you to come and check it out and see. Let me say a couple things about the documents that are on the tables for those of you who are here. There is a survey that is on the table that we'd love for you to fill out, because we use this when we're setting up topics for next summer, and we're trying to work on pub theology for next summer. We use your feedback for that, so I really want to encourage you to take a moment to do that. And the second form I'll tell you about is I tell you about the format. The way this is going to go is our speaker is going to come up and speak for about 40 minutes, more or less, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break when we'll have Ryan come back and do some more music. And after the break, we will come back for 20 minutes of Q&A. And the way we do the questions, though, is if you will write your question on the little slips of paper that are on your tables, and then we'll collect those during the break. That'll give our speaker a chance to organize them and see what's coming and kind of get his plans together. If you are watching online, you can send in through the comments or through email your questions that way. So that's the format for the evening. Let me turn to our speaker. It's my great privilege to get to introduce Dr. Billy Abraham. He is absolutely one of my favorite theologians in the world and one of the smartest people that I know. Let me say just a little bit about his background. He has been a longtime professor at Perkins School of Theology at SMU. I think for 36 years. He's been over there as the Albert Cook Outler Professor of Wesley Studies. He taught me systematic theology and loved him there. He, in terms of his background on education, well, he grew up in Ireland. You'll hear that it's not quite a Texas twang he's got. He's got a different little accent going there. But he did his undergrad at Queen's University in Belfast, and then he came to the States, to Asbury, and did his Master's of Divinity. And then he went to Oxford, where he did his PhD in philosophy. He has published a lot of books, many of them by Oxford University Press. He's well-known, highly regarded theologian, and it's a privilege to have him here this evening. He retired from SMU just in May, so he's fresh out of that, and it's funny to talk to him because he's got a long list of projects he's working on. He's not slowing down. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Billy Abraham?
Well, let me say what a great pleasure it is to be here. This must be Irish night because we have a Flanagan who's singing. Now, Abraham is not exactly an Irish name, but I am the real thing. I come from the area in the south of the north, which you have to explain to people. But if you come in from Sligo into the Lake District, County Fermanagh, Enniskillen, that area, absolutely beautiful area in the south of the north of Ireland. That's where I come from. And one other word of introduction, after having thanked Bob for that splendid and beautiful introduction. I'm delighted to hear that you had my colleague Ruben Abito here last week. And I was actually I chaired the search committee that brought Ruben both to Texas and to Perkins. And it was quite a journey for him. As you probably know, he has been a Jesuit priest. He married a wonderful woman from Germany. My wife and I we were told that we needed to have special prayers for his potential mother-in-law, who was a delightful German lady. And then I actually was best man at his wedding, which I consider to be a great honor. And I have to tell you, we had a wonderful reception afterwards. And we went into Kirby Parlour, which is a beautiful building over at Perkins. And we had, lovely time with speeches and some food. And then Reuben picked up the guitar. And he sang. And the name of the song was, I Did It My Way. So I'm delighted to follow Reuben in this noble lineage of speakers that you have here, not quite in the pub, but in this delightful setting. Now, I want to begin with a story, and it's going to be kind of the initial backdrop to where I'm going to go in this session. Some years ago, I was teaching in Kathmandu in Nepal. In fact, I was teaching in a converted chicken coop, which is an interesting thing to do. And the people in Nepal, in Kathmandu, are just so precious. They're so gracious, they're so kind. And they insisted that before I left Nepal, I needed to go on an elephant ride. Now, I have to be honest and say, I needed to go on an elephant ride as much as I needed a hole in the head. But I wanted to be reciprocal in my graciousness, so we traveled way off into the center of Nepal. I think it was to a place called Chitwan. We got on our elephant, had our elephant ride, and we stayed the night in a hotel. It was pouring with rain, and there were very, very few people there. But there was a young fella from Copenhagen, and he was over on one end of the dining room, and myself and my host were in another area. And, being friendly, we invited him to join us at the table. And you had the small talk, who are you, where you're from, what are you doing here? And he got to the point where he said, well, what do you do? And I'm never quite sure how to answer that question. And I said, well, I teach theology. I'm a theologian. And his response was immediate, and I would say very candid. I have no time for that kind of nonsense. I don't believe in magic or superstition. So rather than let things go and sort of just be an affable Irishman, I decided I'll talk to this fella. I said, that's very interesting. And I said, given that you're a master's student, I presume that you've given some thought to this proposition which you've just put before me. So I'd love you to answer a few of my questions. And he said, well, okay. So I said, have you read any theology? He said, I have more important subjects to engage my attention. But I wasn't going to let it go. So I said, read any Origen? No. Any Augustine? No. Aquinas? No. Well, what about Teresa of Avila? And then I started going just on a list. John Calvin, John Wesley, Jonathan Edwards, Phoebe Palmer, Karl Barth, Morris Wiles, James Cone, Ellen Cherry, Rosemary Radford Ruther, Gustavo Gutierrez, and Sarah Coakley, fine Anglican theologian. And of course he said no, emphatically, every time I kept asking my question. So then I said, you know something? You're one of the stupidest, ill-informed, thoughtless, asinine, brainless students that I've ever met in over 30 years' work as a professor. You are prepared to dismiss theology as magic and superstition, even though you've never read a line of theology in your life. And I said, if that's not irrational, I don't know what is. And then without pausing for breath, I said to him, have you ever thought about reading one of the Gospels? Oh, he said, well, no, but I think I did read the Gospel of Judas on the internet. He wouldn't even buy a copy. Well, I noted, there's hope for you yet. So I'll offer you a deal. One of these days you may grow up and realize how stupid you are. And if that happens, here's my card. Call me and reverse the charges. Now, you can tell that I'm in an Irish mood tonight after I tell a story like that. But what this story reveals to me is that the debate about atheism and theism, in my judgment, has been deeply flawed. And if we're going to make any serious progress on the dispute between theists and atheists, we're going to have to step back and do some very serious thinking about what's the relevant evidence and what kind of considerations do we need to bring to the table. So the point of the story I've just given you is that I want to draw attention, and I'll unpack this in due course, to what I think is a very serious flaw in the discussion. And if I may flatter those of you who are Episcopalian and whatnot, one of the truly great contributions of the Anglican tradition to the discussion is that it has actually corrected that flaw, but it's not been taken up sufficiently clearly and substantially within the literature or within the discussion. And I will get to that substantively in due course. But I want to make one other major preliminary comment. One of the lovely things about getting to retirement, or at least I've already flunked it, by the way, so I'll leave it at that. If you're a child of John Wesley, you're a workaholic, so there's no hope for you whatsoever. You Anglicans, you Episcopalians, you wrecked Methodism by giving us John Wesley. And what I want to make is a comment about the way in which the debate about God has actually transformed and transmuted over the last, I would say, 60 to 70 years. Now, I'm old enough to have been taught by absolutely first-rate atheists, both in the hard-nosed psychology department where I was trained at Belfast, and above all, in the philosophy department where I was trained, where among the philosophers there was only one serious believer, and he was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. He had brilliant lectures on Kant. And I remember vividly when he lectured on Immanuel Kant, I still actually have his notes and I'm digging them up out of my office at the moment. He would pick a spot on the end of the wall and all you could see were the whites of his eyes. So that's how open he was to serious conversation about matters theological and otherwise, even though he was an elder in the Presbyterian Church. But all of my teachers otherwise were basically atheists of one kind or another. And when I got to Oxford, of course, I found my favorite atheist of all time, and that's a man called Sir Isaiah Berlin. Berlin, brought up Orthodox Jew, probably one of the greatest intellectuals of the 20th century. I had a seminar with him in philosophy of history. One of my deep regrets is that I didn't actually take up his invitation to go visit with him, and I was interested in issues related to the philosophy of history. But here's what was important about the atheists of that generation, the ones who taught me. They kept their atheism private. And you had to sort of like dig it out of them. And the reason for that was that they were tutored by the Greeks. And they remember that there was a famous philosopher by the name of Socrates who got into serious trouble with the state because he challenged the views of the day, and they'd come to the conviction, look, when it comes to religion, don't scare the horses. You never know what these people will do if they lose faith in God. And so for the most part, it was kept entirely private. And in fact, many of them had wonderful religious funerals. So Isaiah Berlin was given full honors as an Orthodox Jew, even though he was a complete unbeliever. Now, I find that extremely interesting in terms of a vision of atheism in that first phase. But then you had the second phase, and the one that's made a lot of noise over the last 20 to 30 years, led by what we call the four horsemen of the apocalypse, namely Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett. Now, we could teach a whole course on what these people have argued. I can't do that, obviously, in the time that I've got here. But what I want to draw attention to is the shift that happened from that first phase of atheism to a second phase. And what you got was you moved from their atheism being a private, sort of more or less very deeply personal conviction, to going right into the public sphere, into the public arena, and aggressively attacking any and every form of religion they could get their hands on. So you get Harris doing it out of his background in psychology. You get Richard Dawkins doing it out of his background as a brilliant, brilliant scientist and biologist. You've got Daniel Dennett, who still teaches at MIT, one of the great philosophers of mind of the 20th century. And then you had Christopher Hitchens, who was just simply an extraordinary intellectual sort of fire hose. By the way, he was taught by Methodists outside Cambridge. I think, the best traditions produce the best rebels. Think about that. And the key point about them, the key point I want to make here, is that they moved into the public arena, and basically not only did they try to establish that Christianity or theism, broadly conceived, was false, they wanted to also say it was toxic, it was poisonous. Don't let it into the public square, because God knows who you'll vote for after you become a theist. Now, what I want to say is that we're now entering into a further third phase. This is still my second preliminary point, by the way. And I got wind of this about 3 years ago when I was asked to participate in a debate. Now, I'm actually not a debater, but I was asked to participate in a debate at SMU. And it was on, the old chestnut, does God exist? And they couldn't find anybody to represent atheism. They went to the philosophy department and found a very fine theist. They went to the religious studies department. They went all over the place. And then eventually they came to me and they said, would you please represent the atheist option? I said, of course I will. I know how to channel this stuff. Particularly David Hume, that great skeptic from Scotland. And so I showed up and I had a red version of what I'm wearing here. I call it my Chairman Mao outfit. And I said, now I want to be very clear, I'm not a Maoist atheist. And then I brought with me a cowboy hat, which I had in a bag. I'd never worn a cowboy hat until this occasion. And so when it was my turn to make my piece, to say my piece, I opened the bag, put on a cowboy hat, and I said, I want you to realize now that I'm a Texas atheist. And I said, of course you want to know what that is. Well, I live in Texas, and I go to church. And now you want to know why an atheist would go to church. And the answer is, that's where the money is. And I had them right there in the palm of my hand. Now, I tell you that because I think it's a good story, but I thought, what's going on here? Why couldn't they find somebody to represent the atheistic cause? And since then, I've just been digging around, if you like, in the flower beds. And if you look at the new generation of atheists that are coming through, particularly, for example, James Lindsay, and a person called Peter Boghossian, he's a professor up in Portland State University, who actually wrote a book called basically a manual for creating atheists, which he used teaching in the university. Both of them came out with all guns blazing, but if you watch the transposition within them, they've now actually backed off. And that is amazing. And even Dawkins has backed off. Why? Because of the massive cultural shift in which the atheists of that second phase are now being accused of not being sufficiently critical, of not being sufficiently postmodern, of not having bought into critical race theory and whatnot. And you have this amazing what I would call development, where James Lindsay, who is a PhD in mathematics, a very sharp guy, who was part of that team that were out there trying to make a living in part out of attacking theism, they now are actually, if you look at their podcasts where a lot of this stuff goes on, they now are making common cause, even, dare I say it, with fundamentalist Christians, because they actually realize that something's happening in the culture in which both the older version of atheism, which was committed to reason and rationality, and the Christian tradition, which has been committed to reason and rationality, they actually belong together. And they're now actually prepared to join hands because there's a much deeper set of problems have emerged in which the commitment to reason, the commitment to objectivity, the commitment to rationality has in fact been deeply eroded in certain parts of the culture and parts of the university. So that's my long-winded second introductory comment. The first one is that I think there's a serious flaw in the way the whole issue has been approached. And the second point I've had to make is if you look at the historical genealogical developments over the last 50, 60, 70 years, I think there's a sea change that's emerged. And I think that's worth recording and worth paying attention to. But let me come back now to what is the crucial issue. I said as the part of my opening comment that there's, I think, a crucial flaw in the way in which the whole debate between theists and atheists has been sort of developed and taken place. In fact, it's a flaw with three dimensions, and I just want to identify them quickly. If we're going to have a serious discussion between theists and atheists, we're going to have to look at what Aristotle called, it's a simple principle, is called the principle of epistemic fit. Now that's the only technical term I'm going to hopefully use tonight. Epistemic fit means if you have a set of propositions or a proposition that you want to evaluate, you've got to be clear about what's the relevant evidence that you need to bring to the table. So to take a rather crude example, if I lose my dogs, I have 3 Cocker Spaniel dogs. The best therapy I ever bought. One is called Murphy, one is called Liam, and one is called Sophie. And there's a wonderful hierarchy between the 3 of them. Suppose I lose and I want to know what's happened to my Cocker Spaniel dogs. It will not help to go and have a course in biochemistry to figure out where my dogs are. Now that's putting it very crudely and sort of dramatically. But if I want to do serious historical investigation about what's happened in the past and the complexity, say, for example, of the causes of the First World War, I can't go do experiments in the physics department and get that resolved. There's such a thing as relevant evidence. And you need to be aware what, in fact, is going to be the relevant evidence if, in fact, you're going to discuss the issue of the relationship between, or the normative values of atheism over against theism. So that's my first sort of flaw I think is at stake. Now, by the way, I think we Christians cooked our own goose at this stage because we tried to make it out as a matter of proof. And as I'm going to argue in my third point in a second, it's rarely that considerations of this nature are a matter of proof. And we've got to figure out what to do on the other side of that. The second point I want to make in terms of the flaw that's been central to this is that the debate has been about what I would call mere theism. You believe in God, maybe with certain omniproperties, omniscient, omnipresent, omnibenevolent, and so on and so forth. And you sort of, there's the theists on one side, the atheists deny it, and they go at it and argue about what I would call mere theism. But to be quite frank about it, I've not met very many mere theists. If you're a theist, you're either a Muslim theist, or a Christian theist, or a Jewish theist. Theism actually is a much richer, much more subtle network of beliefs that we have. Not simply a proposition like belief in God or not belief in God. What you've got when you deal with theism and atheism is you've got to deal with, in fact, robust, rich versions of theism. We'll get to atheism in due course. So the way I want to insist on is if you're going to discuss this issue, I'm committed to what I would call sort of classical Christianity. The kind of stuff that lapsed Irishman developed called C.S. Lewis, called mere Christianity. Or that we invented this at Perkins, we call it canonical theism. What do I mean by canonical theism? I mean the theism that was actually adopted by the church. The church didn't say, okay, there's just a God. The church gives us a vision of creation. It gives us a vision of what's gone wrong with the world. It gives us a vision of what's been done to fix it in terms of what's happened in Israel and what's happened in Jesus, what happens in the sacraments of the church. It gives you a vision of what the future is going to look like, and it gives you with that a whole complex ethics that goes together with that. So it's not a debate between sort of mere theists and mere atheists. You're going to have to take seriously what I would call the highly ramified character of the beliefs that are at stake. And once you do that, then you've got to ask, what's the relevant kind of evidence that you want to put in play? Now here, I want to pay homage to the Anglican tradition, the English tradition, because right from the time of Richard Hooker, through Bishop Butler, who didn't like Wesley, Bishop Butler thought that Methodism was a horrid thing, a very horrid thing. But he was brilliant intellectually, through to John Henry Newman in the 19th century, on into F.R. Tennant in the early part of the 20th century. These are all absolutely top-notch Anglicans, right through to Basil Mitchell, who was one of my own teachers at Oxford in my generation, and I'm now writing his intellectual biography. They all took the view that the whole idea of simply making this a matter of proof and disproof is not the game that you're in. And what you need to consider is a network of cumulative case arguments. Now, what do I mean by that? This is not a matter of special pleading. Suppose you're trying to figure out who to vote for. It's rarely, well, maybe it is for you, it's not for me. You know, well, there's this network of convictions and policies and whatnot over here. There's another network of convictions and policies over there. I've got to figure out, well, I can see this supports that and this other consideration supports it. There's a problem at this front. And what's at stake is that many of our deepest decisions are not a matter of proof and disproof. They're a matter of cumulative case arguments which can be anchored in certain particular forms of evidence and then supplemented by other forms of evidence which need to be actually brought to the table. Now, I think this is exactly the way in which I would want to myself articulate and defend the deep truths of the Christian faith, the kind of truths that are found in the Nicene Creed or in the Apostles' Creed. And I'm going to sort of just give you my own sort of way of thinking about this, because there are many ways into it, and the cumulative case argument can be started at any point so long as you bring to bear on it all of the relevant considerations. Now here, forgive me if I'm just a bit of a bog Irishman, my generation, my mother's generation was the last generation of nominal Christians in the north of Ireland. Ireland has lost the Christianity that we saved in the medieval period. It's very interesting. I don't know how we're going to win back Ireland. It's going to be an interesting proposition. Maybe you Anglicans can do it, or Episcopalians. I once told the Archbishop of Canterbury, we Irish saved civilization the last time, it's your turn. See, not often you get to sit down to dinner with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I became an atheist when I was about 16. I thought initially it was just a bad dose of measles. Intellectual measles. You're growing up and you've been exposed to the Christian faith at church, at home. My family were totally nominally Christian. They didn't want to have anything serious to do with Jesus. They didn't bash Jesus or anything like that. They just left it alone. But Jesus just got in your way. And so I was, if you like, a kind of hard-nosed, incipient. That's too strong. I was an incipient materialist. I was an incipient empiricist. The only things that are real are the things that are available to your senses. And then, if you're brought up in Ireland, one of the things you realize that people are not nice always. They're nice if you're a tourist. but we tend to kill each other when you leave. And I had a very strong sense that there was evil abroad in the world. Now, listen to me very carefully. I could conceive of the existence of the demonic. Now, if you want a lecture on this, bring me back, but I'll charge you double. I actually have a whole lecture on this stuff. And I suddenly find myself, well, by the way, after I became an atheist, I was so happy. Because, people said, well, if you don't believe, you're going to hell. But if there's no God, there's no hell. Great. Relax. I was then free to think about it, and I said, I'll think about it for 3 months, which I did. And I was outside the Salvation Army Hall on the Sligo Road in Enniskillen, and it suddenly hit me like a ton of bricks. My opposition to belief in God at that stage, and broadly more of the Christian tradition, was I thought the very notion of God was incoherent because God was not available to the senses. And suddenly I realized I could conceive of the existence of evil. And I could conceive of, I didn't believe at that stage, in the existence of the demonic. I was in deep trouble at that stage. And then I started reading the Gospels. I would do it late at night because I didn't want the family to see what I was up to. It's like talking to teenagers. Talk to teenagers at 2 o'clock in the morning. That's when they're alive. Don't do it on a Sunday morning. They have other things on their heads. But what happened to me was I then started to read the New Testament. I read J.B. Phillips's translation of Paul. I had no idea what was going on in that material. But one thing I was sure about, this guy has encountered something that I think is important to him and has been important to people down through the ages. And I need to pay attention. Then I started listening to the sermons. I would take out the hymn book in my church. I'd pretend to be reading the hymn book. I was listening to every word the preacher was saying. And within 3 months, I found myself not only coming back to belief in God, insofar as I had belief in God beforehand, I found myself, by the way, with a call into the ministry. And I thought, that's crazy. I know there's debates about gender in our own generation, but I thought there were male and female and ministers, and I didn't want to be one of these over here. I'm serious. I thought those people didn't need to go to the toilet. I thought they lived in some sort of pious, holy bubble where they didn't need to sort of do things like that, to clean their rooms or anything. And so I had this encounter with God. And I couldn't shake it. So what am I getting at here? You can begin, as I did, with 2 things. One was that the Christian tradition took evil radically seriously. Now, I'll come back to that as an argument against the reality of God in a moment. But what I found astonishing was that Bible, that kick-ass deity of the Old Testament. You can't read that stuff without being an ultra-realist. It's amazing material. Once you sort of get past the kind of literalist reading of some of this stuff, it really is something. And it's profoundly realistic. And what's the heart of the gospel? It's about crucifying a figure who was Jesus, no less. So I find myself, this tradition takes evil really seriously. And then I got, who is this Jesus? And the incarnation hit me like a ton of bricks. The God who is invisible had become visible in human history. Even a child could understand this. As Aquinas put it later, I only read Aquinas later on, the little old lady in tennis shoes, this is a rough translation of the original Latin, the little old lady in tennis shoes knows more about God if she knows about Jesus than the greatest philosopher you've ever met. Because in the divine revelation that has come in Christ, we encounter God. Then I found myself stricken with conspicuous sanctity. You say, well, what's that? It's not a drink, by the way. What are you going to do with the Mother Teresa's of this world? These people, you're just sort of shocked by how good they are. And I knew them in my own church. I knew them in the Anglican church, the Episcopal church, the Church of Ireland, where I brought up. And you would ask these people, well, how come you're so good? And they would say, it's not me. It's the grace of God. It's the action of God, the Holy Spirit. And I thought, oh. Now here's the problem you've got if you're not a believer. These people are radically honest. You can't accuse them of lying. So you're going to have to find some really fancy explanation. Well, maybe it was the potty training they had, huh? Or give them the right sort of social conditions, and they will sort of produce this conspicuous sanctity. None of that washed. They had an explanation as to why they are the way they are, namely, it was the work of the living God. Now, you see what I'm doing here is that it was a combination initially of issues, like the existence of Christ, the divine revelation that came through him, the realism about sin and evil. You learn a whole theological vocabulary to come to terms with that. You have to deal with your own encounter with God, and you can't shake it off. I can give you the principle that you work with if you take that seriously. Then you have got to deal with conspicuous sanctity. Then you've got to deal with why is there a world all around us? What are we going to do with all this beautiful music? What about Mozart and Willie Nelson and Dolly Parton and the choir? Where did all this come from? Just out of nowhere? Just pure chance? And on and on and on. And in fact, what you find is that the way to tackle is you begin not with a small scale set of propositions like just belief in God. You have a cluster of propositions. And then what you find is that there is a cumulative set of considerations, and at certain points they just sort of come together, and you have the aha moment, and you say, I can't hold out any longer. This is what makes the best sense of my life, and this is what makes the best sense of all of these relevant considerations that you can line up. Now, of course, the problem is the problem of evil. And I'm not going to rehearse the technical issues of that. I have a different kind of problem of evil than most people. I don't understand why God doesn't knock off certain people. I am deadly serious about this. If you want to read a book that will make your hair stand on end, read a little book called In Order to Live by Eunomi Park, who's just come out of North Korea, made it through China, actually ended up for a while in Texas and now is in New York. That guy, and forgive me, I hope this is not going to get me in trouble, I don't understand why God doesn't bump off that guy in North Korea. Sleep apnea. It'll take a while with sleep apnea, but an odd heart attack here and there. So the problem of evil constitutes a really serious problem. I leave aside that. That's a problem you have when you become a robust theist. But there is the standard problem that given God's properties, how come there's so much appalling evil in the world, both human evil and natural evil? And the answer is, that's a real objection. But it's not a decisive objection. And by the way, the best treatment of this is the book of Job. Because if you look at Job, he won't have any of the sort of like simple-minded responses to this. What Job does in the end, he finds himself confronted. This is an argument from religious experience. He finds himself confronted with the living God. And he says, up until now, I heard you with the hearing of my ears. Now I see you face to face. And there's more than enough evidence on that side to leave the issue of evil as one where you don't have a full-blooded, relatively or fully coherent way to make sense of it. But that's what cumulative case arguments are like. They involve arguments against your position, but they do not necessarily decisively overturn your position. And that's where I think the debate has to go. Now, I've got 5 minutes, so I need to bring this to a close. What's my real problem with the atheists? Whatever most generations they come out with. I think they cheat. I don't mean that in a cheap way. Let me put the issue this way. Suppose you could give me a pill Philosophers love having these kinds of thought experiments. Let's say a little green pill. It's an Irish pill. And overnight, you're going to wipe my mind, my consciousness, of all of my theistic convictions. So what do you want me to believe tomorrow, now that I've become an atheist? Do you want me to be an existentialist atheist? Do you want me to be a Marxist atheist? Do you want me to be a Buddhist atheist? Do you want me to be a Nietzschean atheist? Do you want me to be a kind of hard-nosed materialist atheist? What I'm finding in the discussion, I would qualify this a little bit, but not for the purposes here. Most of the people who are arguing for atheism think, oh, we just knocked down your arguments and that's the end of it. No, it's not the end of it. You need to tell us what your alternative is. And you need to do it in some detail. And then you need to tell me, what do you think is the relevant evidence for and against the position that you're developing? And generally, they don't even think about that. They have general considerations like consistency, lack of contradictions, but that's not enough to resolve the distinction between these, or the choice between these various forms of atheism. Then I want to know, have you considered the objections towards your position? I mean, the really hard objection is the existence of consciousness. Not get into the details on that. I think conspicuous sanctity is a massive problem for atheists. That's why many atheists are not converted by propositional arguments. They run into saints. I mean, real, earthy, absolutely wonderful human beings. And they say, where do these people come from? And the answer is they came from God. So what's their alternative explanation for this? So they need to deal with the objections to their own position. And then when they've done all of that, then we're going to have a serious discussion. But what we have now, and have had now for so long, is a sort of dispute between, proposition God exists and proposition God does not exist. Those are abstractions from the real thing. I just don't believe in God. I believe in God as a creator. I believe in a God who's been interfering in the lives of those strange people called Jews, all down through the centuries. I believe that God showed up in the womb of a little teenage virgin. Wow. I believe that God raised him from the dead and given us the gift of the Holy Spirit, drawing us into intimate love and fellowship with the living God, and giving us a sense of peace that the world cannot give. I could go on and on. It's that I'm interested in. So if you're going to give me a package of atheism, give me the functional equivalent. And then, as I say, lay it out clearly. Tell me what the appropriate evidence should be. Tell me that you have it. Show me that you've got it. We Christians have been working on this for centuries. And then finally, you've got to answer objections. So stop cheating and let's have a real discussion. That's my final word for tonight, for now.
So we are going to take about a 10-minute break, and in about 3 minutes or so, Ryan Flanagan will come up and play for us again. Please take a few moments and fill out your question and answer card. I'll come around and gather those. And also feel free to fill out the survey card if there's a topic you'd like to hear in the future. If you've got a comment or a question or a concern, please feel free to register it there, and we'll pick that up as well.
believe in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord. He was conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit and born of the Virgin Mary. He suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day he rose again. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come again to judge the living and the dead. Spirit, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting.
Well, thank you guys so much for inviting me to be a part of this tonight. I was thinking that the Irish are coming. Isn't there it's such an honor to share the stage with such a wonderful Irishman. Something that Dr. Billy said that just really struck me was concerning the problem of evil. Just how great a problem the problem of evil is for us theists, and really for every human being. But we have an amazing book in our Bible called the Psalms, which actually helps us tremendously when we are confronted with evil in our own lives, not just as we try to defend the faith, but as we are confronted and bombarded by evil as we go about our days. And so Psalm 11 is one of my favorite psalms. It's a psalm of lament, and it deals with when evil people, when people who are trying to kill us are confronting us, we find our refuge in the Lord. And so I'm going to sing you a setting to Psalm 11.
In the Lord have I taken refuge. How then can you say to me, fly away like a bird to the hilltop? For see how the wicked bend their bow and fit their arrows to the string to shoot from ambush at the pure of heart when the foundations are being destroyed. What can the righteous do? The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. His eyes behold the inhabited world. His piercing eye weighs our worth. The Lord weighs the righteous as well as the wicked, but those who delight in violence he abhors. Upon the wicked he shall rain coals of fire and burning sulfur. A scorching wind shall be their lot, for the Lord is righteous. He delights in righteous deeds, and the just shall see his face. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. In the Lord have I taken refuge. How then can you say to me, fly away like a bird to the hilltop?
Amen. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you so much for coming to be with us today. So we're going to have about 20 minutes of question and answer with Dr. Abraham, and he will also be here for a few minutes afterwards if you would like to speak with him more personally. So let's welcome him again.
Okay, I'll begin with some what I consider to be straightforward, simple questions, and then to get to more complicated ones. So one of these is, did the master's student ever get in touch with you? I'm afraid he didn't. Now, it was a very delicate situation at that point, but happily I had a very dear friend of me who was a convert from Hinduism with me, who was in fact a Brahmin, who was a Hindu priest. And he took over the conversation and saved it, because after you give somebody a tumble like that, you've got to figure out how we were going to continue the meal together. And so he never got back to me. So there we are.
Teaching a Baylor.
Now, this is sort of like, do you believe, if you believe in God, should you tell everyone about God? Answer is no. Why? Because some things are very delicate. And they're especially delicate with children, with your children and your grandchildren. And very often, I remember my own case, just to give it personal, when I came to faith, my blessed mother, she thought, oh, Billy, you've not become religious, have you? She came to faith much later through the Eucharist with a very fine Methodist minister in Ireland. And I'm glad I didn't take on my mother. The same happened to my brother. When I came to faith, he said, I hated your guts. It's a rather direct way of getting at it. And so I said, I made a rule at that stage in the family that I would never bring up the issue of my faith, because I didn't want to be in any way a hypocrite. And I'd let them make the first move. Now, that's a very general proposition that I worked off. But I know a lot of eggheads, too many probably for my own good. And what I've discovered is that you need to think about the process of sharing your faith as moving people along a line where there may be total hostility. And they simply think, maybe there's something in this after all. To the point where you can recommend a book, or where you can have a serious conversation with them. To the point where you can actually help them over, if you like, the final hurdles, coming to the church and being baptized, confirmed, and being part of the community. And I think you need to think of it in terms of a continuum of that stage. And here is where the words of our Lord to the disciples, they were all worried about when they would be brought to court. And they say, what are we going to say? And the Lord said, in that very hour, the words that you need will be given to you by the Holy Spirit. So my view is that you need to simply be sensitive and open to the impulses, so say the inspiring work of the Spirit. But a general rule in which you're going to talk to everybody is not, I think, basically a good rule. My oldest son was once confronted by some people from Dallas Theological Seminary when he was a student at SMU, and he was sitting on a seat out at the university, and someone came up to him and said, "Has anybody ever talked to you about Jesus?" He said, "Yes, just 5 minutes ago." Now, I want to be sensitive at this stage, because there are circumstances when, I think what you're getting at here is the work of an evangelist, and that's a whole other topic, and about how you share your faith. And it's where I think we need public meetings where people can actually hear the gospel without being, so to speak, put on the spot right away. So bringing them to church. So that's my answer to that question. Can you comment about people who say they're spiritual but not religious? Are they mere theists? A very brief comment. This is actually a very, very interesting project in terms of how do we reach people, and there are about 95 million of them, who are nones, N-O-N-E-S. And one of them has just written a book, who's one of my former students. And she's very nice to me, actually. She calls me her favorite Irish professor, which I thought was very gracious. And so she's actually set up an operation to help people who have been deeply abused within the church and don't want to actually reconnect with the church, but want to be spiritual. Now, I have no, quick and easy comment about that, other than we've got to understand these folk. And I think the problem of high salesmanship, pressure on a lot of people, especially in contexts where there is controlling either fathers or church leaders, some of whom have engaged in the most appalling abuse of particularly young women. We've got our work cut out just to convince those people that we don't mean them harm. And that requires a lot of love and care and presence. And so I wanted this, tonight I'm in a sympathetic mood on this front. I want to actually be very sympathetic to these folk, because, I can put it theologically. It's silly. You can't have Jesus without his body. Who's going to bury you? The kingdom has got a community. I could lay it on the line in terms of theologically what the requirements of Christian discipleship are, but that's not where they are. They're hurting. And they need loving care above all else. And then we've got to think through how we deal with that. There is actually a book written by a very fine Southern Baptist called How to Reach the Hard to Reach. And so there's a lot of work to be done in that area with respect to those who are spiritual but do not want to be part of the institutional church. What's your opinion of Sam Harris? Well, I wish I could charge his fees. He has a bodyguard whenever he shows up as well. So you get to fly first class, and your fee is about $25,000 a shot. I was once asked if I would have an engagement with him, and I said, well, provided you give me the same money he's getting, I'll show up. Actually, Harris is very interesting. His background is in neuroscience, and that's a whole other sort of terrain that needs careful attention. But where I agree with Harris is that Harris has argued that the basics of morality, the fundamental basics of what I would call conscience, do not require religious commitment. Now, this is a well-known position that has been developed across the years in particularly the Anglican tradition. It's in C.S. Lewis. I've argued for it in my own works. And in fact, I think Harris often picks as his interlocutor someone who says, well, look, if you are not a believer, you don't have any foundation for morality. Well, what would that mean? It means if you stop believing in God, everything is permitted. You can now roast babies alive at 3 o'clock in the morning for fun and don't feel any conscience about it. But here's the truth about what I see as the deep version of the faith that I'm interested in. What's conscience? It's not written in a book. It's written on our hearts. God has created us in such a way that, in fact, often it's unbelievers who are far more morally sensitive than believers. My favorite agnostic at the moment is a man called Theodore Dalrymple. If any of you have come across his work, he's a remarkable individual. His father was a Russian communist who came to England. His mother was Jewish, who escaped the Nazis. He is a psychiatrist. In the morning, he worked in Birmingham, England. He worked in the psychiatric ward in the morning and in the prison in the afternoon. So he had a front row seat for the bottom end of British culture, of English culture. He's one of the most penetrating moral observers of the cultural developments in England at this point. And he's not a believer. Now, how do you explain that? Well, you explain it because he's made in the image of God. And he didn't come into the world as some sort of just naked tabula rasa. He comes into the world and grows up in a world where, in fact, he doesn't need to read it in a book that it's not a good thing to beat the daylights out of your girlfriend or boyfriend. That it's not a good thing to be burglaring all the houses. By the way, one of the reasons why there's a lot of burglary in Britain, not here, is because of all the guns here. It's interesting. I just say that. I'm not getting into the discussion about it. I'm leaving all that aside. So my favorite atheist at the moment is a fellow who wrote about Douglas Murray. If you've not read Douglas Murray, the maddening of crowds, I think it's a number of books, brilliant books. And he's not a believer at all. He's one of the most penetrating moral commentators on our culture. So Harris, I think, gets that. Now, of course, if you are a deep Christian theist, you ask yourself, well, how come we come equipped with this? How come that we know it's wrong to roast babies alive at 3 o'clock in the morning for fun before we have a moral lecture about it? You can add your own list here. It's because, actually, it's part of what it is to be created by a good and gracious and wonderful God. We do have a deep explanation as to why that's the case. But happily, you don't have to have that in place in order to have a conscience. Now, I qualify this in one respect because here's another question that sort of, I think, comes nicely on the tail end of this. Doesn't the growing apathy or atheism show that the God thing was a way of filling the gap of our own ignorance? Well, I know. The growing apathy about atheism is because atheists are being upended by people who don't believe in rationality. Now, the technical term for this are postmodernists. They migrated out of France, they came to Yale, they came into the various history departments, they've come into English departments all over the place, they show up in the continental philosophical tradition. I'll not bore you with all the details. And these people are disillusioned modernists. This comes back to the central thesis I'm arguing constructively and positively. The problem of putting all this as a matter of proof and disproof is that John Wesley actually said, I worked on this and I found the proofs convincing on Monday and Tuesday. By the time I got to Thursday, they didn't work. Which is why Wesley turned to other kinds of evidence, which are very important, very interesting. But the point I want to get at here is a lot of what's gone on is that people were promised the moon and then they didn't get it. And so they say anything goes. There are no norms of rationality that apply across the board, because the standard of proof was either some strange version of science that they had, or more generally of mathematics. If that's the standard, you're not going to get to God, is my point. And when people had that as the standard and then abandoned it, that's when modernism emerged. And so I think what's happened to the atheists of that second phase that I mentioned is that they've realized that they overcooked their vision of rationality and have been eaten alive by their own children and grandchildren. And now they're having to step back and ask, like the first generation did, what if we let loose here? What if we lose a vision of human beings as rational, made in the image of God? What if we lose commitment to, as best we can, objectivity in history, in science, morality, the whole liberal arts world? What if we lose all of that? What if we lose any objective sense of justice? Well, what you're going to end up with is anything's going to go. And once you get that, this is where Dalrymple's work is so important. Once that gets embedded in certain segments of the media and in the universities and elsewhere, it trickles down, and the people who really suffer are people at the bottom end of the food chain. And they have sort of been bereft of the cultural legacy that's built upon being made in the image of God and being committed to rationality. Now, maybe in line with this, can you elaborate more on your point about the fundamentalist Christians and atheists combining to confront cancel culture? I'm thinking particularly here of the work of James Lindsay, who's really given himself fully professionally to understanding critical theory. Critical theory emerged, and then I give you a whole lecture on this, you'll be bored to tears, and I'll not give it to you, and I'll just give you a Reader's Digest version. It arose in the 1920s. It was developed by a brilliant Marxist called Antonio Gramsci, who was put in prison for terrorism. And they said that'll shut him up. And he wrote a set of remarkable letters from prison, which were published by a professor at the University of Notre Dame, whose son is in the cabinet at the moment. I'll let you work out who he is. And Gramsci said, basically, the problem we had as good old-fashioned unreconstructed Marxists is that violence didn't work. And we're not going to go down the road of Stalin and company. The way to go is we're going to have to go after the culture. And so what Gramsci proposed, and then it spread out from there into the Frankfurt School, which were skeptical Jews who came to California and didn't like it, went back to Frankfurt, brought it into the United States with Marcuse in the 1960s. It then morphed into critical race theory in Harvard at the legal and the law school. And what you've got there is, what's happened is that the atheists and the fundamentalists, if I can, friendly fundamentalists, let's call them that. Let's be nice tonight, okay? I'm not a fundamentalist, either friendly or otherwise. They've realized that, in fact, there's been a hollowing out of the commitment to rationality in the culture. And they've suddenly discovered, in fact, even sort of what they consider to be hopelessly stupid, irrational Christians are not what they thought they were. And so there's a sense now in which they've been coming together in the podcast world and saying, we've got to stand up for rationality. By the way, that's exactly what Ratzinger was trying to get at in the 1970s. And whatever you think of him, I think he was deeply worried about what's going to happen in Europe. Now, that goes to a question that I'm morphing into. Do you think that the erosion of moral responsibility in society has increased the non-belief in God and church? That's a very interesting way to put the question. Now, let me repeat you. Do you think that the erosion of moral responsibility in society has increased the non-belief in God and church? I think it's the other way around. Now, it has to be stated subtly. Let me put the subtle part first. You can't eradicate rationality long-term from human beings. It's built into us by God, if I can put it that way. So even if you take the worst, I love the history of the Soviet Union, if you take the worst of what happened there, you could not kill the intellectual powerhouse that Solzhenitsyn has been. Now, again, whatever you think of the details there. You cannot abolish human beings. This is why I don't like C.S. Lewis as the title of his book, The Abolition of Man. You cannot abolish, ultimately, the human spirit within. It will survive the most appalling sort of torture in the world and cancelling in the world. But there is this point. If you lose the deeper metaphysical and theistic grounding for individualism, for the uniqueness of human beings, and it's not just, by the way, that we're made as human beings, uniquely made in the image of God. Each one of us is a unique expression of the image of God. It's an extraordinary, beautiful notion. That cannot be eradicated. But what can be eradicated is what I would call the supporting music. And the supporting music is, in fact, the history or the content of the scriptures, properly read. It is the deep theological convictions that are articulated in the prayer book, in the creeds of the church, in the great theologians of the church, and in the saints of the church, in the iconography of the church. If you eliminate that over time, you're going to have difficulty holding on to a deep commitment to rationality on the part of the individual. Now, C.S. Lewis pointed this out early on. What have I got? One more question. One more question. Let me just finish this one. C.S. Lewis, that lapsed Irishman, the English stole him like they steal our best footballers and golfers. Rory only made it to the fourth yesterday. But when you lose that, Lewis said, you're going to pay a price. My own teacher, of whom I'm now writing an intellectual biography, began life as a pacifist and a Sufi Hindu who learnt Sanskrit at Oxford and would have become the professor of Sanskrit, I'm morally certain. But when he discovered the reality of Hitler and what was going on with Hitler, he said, my Sufi Hinduism didn't have the moral resources to deal with Hitler. And he quit. He joined the Navy. He was given a prayer book by the chaplain, became a Christian, and took over from C.S. Lewis in the Socratic Club, and has written a series of books which I hope to make, to articulate and make available to the wider culture, articulating how it is that the moral landscape changes, if you're not careful, when you lose the deep resources of the scriptures and of the church. So that's the subtlety. You can't eliminate human beings. We will always bounce back. But if the supporting music, the background music, is not there, it is much more difficult to sustain this, and you become wide open to all sorts of very, very toxic, poisonous doctrines and forms of atheism that are utterly destructive. You say, I have time for one more. Well, there's a lot of questions about evil here. It's terrible to have to stop on evil. Look, there's a genuine problem with evil. And it's the classical one that Hume and the early Greek philosophers identified. If God is all good, he'll want to eliminate, and be motivated to eliminate evil. If God is all powerful, God has the capacity to eliminate evil. So whence evil? Now, there are what I would call partial answers to that. You cannot eliminate, you cannot have free will. Now, this may seem platitudinous. Free will is crucial. And our freedom is not, will I go to the Madeleines or will I go to, where else would I go? Where? Starbucks. By the way, I'm trying to get, please help me on this. I've been sitting at a table in the Madeleines for 35 years. And I want it as a relic. And so I'm arguing that they ought to either give me the table or sell me the table. We've got very trivial decisions, although the decision between Starbucks and Madeleines may not be very trivial. But we can not only make those sorts of decisions, we make decisions about whether we're going to find out how the world works. The more we find out how the world works, the wider the range of things that we can do to one another. So our freedom is not small and platitudinous, it's really deep. And all this dispute that there is about, what are we doing with the COVID stuff? Where did that come from? Think of the choices that have been made with respect to that. And I'm not taking sides on any of those party debates. That's a massive, massive responsibility on our shoulders. Maybe you say too much. So there are ways of dealing with it with respect to freedom, and that can be extended into also the world of natural evil. Richard Swinburne, another superb philosopher in the 20th century, still alive, amazing professor at Oxford, has written extensively on this. But my own view is there are certain things which I cannot provide an adequate or even a conceivable explanation. And if I did, I would lose my moral bearings. Now that would need some unpacking. I mean, take what happens to the Jews, or take the whole issue of terrorism in Ireland, what we've done to one another. I mean, it would have been easy for God to knock out some of these people. But God didn't. So there are certain things that happen, and I cannot conceive of a possible moral explanation for it. But the crucial point is not, is that an objection to us? Of course it's an objection to us. But you're going to have to deal with all of the relevant evidence, not just that. And I'll finish with this because it takes me back to my own beloved professor at Oxford, who was a wonderful Anglican saint, Basil Mitchell, whom I've just mentioned. He wrote a little essay called The Parable of the Stranger, in which he tried to wrestle with, suppose you're in wartime and you're dealing with people on the other side and you're not sure whether to trust these people who are supposed to be on your side, and sometimes you see them do things that don't fit with your vision of who they might be, and other times they look as if you're on your side. And he uses that to bring out the fact that any serious, robust theist like myself and others are going to fully acknowledge the force of this objection. If you're an atheist, this is what you go for. You go for the jugular, if that's the point. But J.D. Vance, very interesting writer that you may have come across, wrote a remarkable book called Hillbilly Elegy. And I'm writing this intellectual biography of Basil Mitchell. And one of my students discovered that what turned J.D. Vance from agnostic to theism to Christianity was Basil Mitchell's essay in which he acknowledged the reality of evil, but said, you got to take into account the range of evidence, including a profound personal experience of God or testimony about profound personal experience of God. Now, we could spend a lot of time in the evening unpacking all of that. It's been central to Methodism. We made a mess of it in the 19th century. We're trying to fix it now in the 21st century. But the point I want to get at here, it's not a problem to admit that there's significant considerations against our position. The crucial issue is, does it somehow disprove the reality of God? And if you work with Butler's great adage that probability is the guide of life, not proof, that probability is what's at stake here, you're going to have to say, well, yes, I don't have a solution here on this one, but I've got so much other evidence on the other side. There's no way I can turn my back on giving my life to Christ and living what may be a life of profound suffering simply to follow him. So that's what I want to say finally about the problem of evil. So a very good night to you all. You've been very gracious and whatnot. And, I'm not going to burn these. I'm going to take them home and think about them.
So thank you all for coming this evening. Come back again next week when our illustrious priest, Father Bob Johnston, speaks on cancel culture. So we look forward to seeing you next week. Bring a friend, elder or youth, and have a good evening.